And I want y'all to go ahead and grab a plate, come back, sit, and then we'll start shortly. But I want you to hear some brilliance with your bellies full. So if you go to the left, Chef John has a wonderful selection for us. Go ahead and grab some dinner, and then we'll get started shortly. No. Oh, really? So you know, you have to have something. I need to go to my. I want to buy it. So. Like this or. Maybe like this here. Sorry. That's here. Like, after me, how long are you? I'm like, are you still passionate? But they keep on. Yeah. Be nice. This time virtue. Yes, yes, I do. You gotta have what you want. And then. Okay, so right.
It's kind of like.
There's a flash.
Yep, yeah.
Yeah,
I get that. Yeah, yeah. Before I get there, here's my, whatever. I'll take it, really said, never again. So, something. It was a mess. But we actually did it again though. Out there, there. It was hot.
Right, check it.
So whenever I saw her against that, oh, they're terrified. Like, this is mine. Train. It costs money every time. Talking about like, it's whatever kind of space and size and all that. It was like this. And I didn't know back then how to size, so I saw it. And I got this. Yeah. That's too big. How are you? Dr. Michael. I should have come to business.
I do. Yeah, it's one of my favorites. I need to do my face. I need to come back.
That's to eat, man. Tuesdays can be a good way. Well,
Very well. To get down.
I think I'm free.
I know.
So I got it. Yeah. Monday. That's
Yeah. Right out. There's very interesting.
My favorite. Second.
I saw this. Great.
How are you?
Right. Okay. Okay. That's nice. Okay. Thank you. It's like I can do this. There's no way. I'm gonna put this website in. Yeah. So that's how we get it. That's it, it's just there, that's where I live. No. Yes, that's. That's right. Should we go out? And that's like, if I'm on the elevator. And then when I. Fine, and that's what that she. Have some. If you can't. Then I sponsor her with the ring back. A little. Perfect. If what I do is, if you do, I'm just gonna do it, it's just like, we're gonna walk it off. Okay.
1 minute.
1 minute. And we go to the door, I will leave. So you go back.
Yes, that's fine.
When I wanted to do it.
Yes, we do.
I just want to type of thing that it had planned to do. No.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for being here. I'm so glad you were able to get some food, because we are excited to get started. Welcome to the Black Church Studies Distinguished Lectureship featuring Dr. Keri Day. I'm gonna read you her bio, and then we're gonna hear from the brilliant Dr. Day, who's making a homecoming of sorts. Keri Day is the Elmer G. Hombrighausen Chair and Professor of Constructive Theology and African American Religion at Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey. In 2023, she was the first African American woman to be promoted to full professor in the 212-year history at Princeton Theological Seminary. She earned a BS in Political Science and Economics from Tennessee State University, an MA in Religion and Ethics from Yale University Divinity School, and her PhD in Religion from Vanderbilt University. She's authored 4 academic books. I'm sure there's more. There's probably more. 4 academic books: Unfinished Business, Black Women, the Black Church, and the Struggle to Thrive in America in 2012, Religious Resistance to Neoliberalism, Womanist and Black Feminist Perspectives in 2015, Notes of a Native Daughter, Testifying in Theological Education in 2021, and her most recent book, Azusa Reimagined, A Radical Vision of Religious and Democratic Belonging in 2022. She's been recognized by NBC News as one of 6 Black women at the center of gravity in theological education in America. Can y'all please help me welcome Dr. Keri Day?
Thank you, Dr. O. Let's see, can you hear me? I have to moderate my voice a bit because I have a 5-year-old daughter, and those that know children under about 6 or 7, during the winter, they bring home everything. And so I'm well, but I'm still recovering in terms of hoarseness from all that she gave. So, oh, excellent, thank you. That way I can moderate my voice. Perfect. It is wonderful to be at Brite in Fort Worth. I came in 2009, fresh out of my PhD program at Vanderbilt, and I cannot begin, like I can't even find the words to describe when I came to Brite, how utterly embraced I was. That's really the truth. Just the way that my work was affirmed, colleagues that I see in here, that I had numerous conversations with, you know, it meant a lot. And to be able to build some of the things that we built together, I'm thinking right now, and I promise, I'm not gonna reminisce for the first 15 minutes, like, maybe a Black Baptist or Black Pentecostal would do. But I remember, back in 2009, some of the programs like evening classes and other sorts of things that at the time, a number of research institutions, in divinity schools and seminaries were not doing. Brite was already sort of thinking about imagining and leading the way on those programs. And now that I am in a place like Princeton, to see how forward thinking Brite Divinity School has been, at least while I was here, and the progressive oasis that it has been, over the last several decades is quite amazing. And so again, I am just elated to be back here and to share with you something new that I am working on. It emerges out in some ways of my book Azusa Reimagined, for those that are familiar with that text, where I am offering a different interpretation of the Azusa Street Revival of 1906, out of which North American Pentecostalism was sort of born. Although I will say there are other sort of multi-factors that helped to shape, I would say, North American Pentecostalism, that Azusa was a central revival in that. So I've written sort of extensively on that, about its democratic potentialities and sort of how, in many ways, its liturgical life was a direct sort of critique of the racial capitalism of the day. And so from there, I've been working on something in the area of pneumatology, sort of further filling out what I perceive to be a part of the practices of late 19th century enslaved communities and early 20th century Black Pentecostal communities with respect to the spirit, and really these practices having a kind of, I was gonna say political, social, but really a kind of cosmic impact with respect to questions and problems of empire. And so I'm excited. This is actually the first time that I'm presenting on a manuscript, this manuscript that I've been now writing for a couple of years. And the title, as you saw on the flyer, Spirit Power, a Pneumatic Ritual and Practice Wonder. Over the last few decades, and I'm sorry, I want to say this, thank you, Dr. O, for the invitation. I wanted to make sure I said that, that you extended the invitation to me. I was saying in the car that, and with Dr. O, that, her work is really been instrumental in constructive theology, not just like womanist theology, but in constructive theology. And I'm learning so much from your work, and so I'm truly appreciative of this invitation. Okay. So over the last few decades, a scholarly explosion has appeared on religious themes of spirit and spirits within theology, religion, Black studies, and studies of mysticism. For several theologians and religious scholars like Selena Stone and Leon Harris, conversations of spirit are being mined for their existential, cosmic, and political power within our current world steeped in states of domination and empire. In Black studies, for example, scholars like Calvin Warren turn to spirit to track the endurance of Black life within an anti-Black world and its humanist logics. In mysticism studies, religious scholars like Grace Christensen, who argues for a reinvigorated study of the spirits to reimagine the study of Black spiritualism, challenges the field's current over-reliance on secular progress narratives, which often emphasize structural liberation above other spiritual outcomes. Spirit and spirits are becoming important across disciplines, not only to the study of faith and religion, but also to an understanding of moral practice and meaning making amid the possibilities and political complexities of our planetary existence. I am currently working on a book manuscript which explores spirit power, and I'm going to be getting into what this term means for me in a second. But spirit power as a pneumatic ritual and a cognitive technology of wonder that has enabled Black communities to defy and even experience delight amid and despite anti-Black systems of violence and death. My aim of this book is to illuminate how wonder can be an epistemic emotion and cognitive technology that helps expand our theological, social, and political imagination in the face of death-dealing systems. A conversation that has historic, and for tonight, much of what I'll be lecturing on will be more historic, but it also has contemporary implications for us today. One of which I will explore at the conclusion of this lecture. Now, of course, I can't unfold my book project this evening. I'm not going to do that. Would that be cruel? So for this lecture, I want to focus on one specific grounding claim of this current book project. I suggest that early 20th century Black Pentecostal practices of spirit power facilitated wonder, which had epistemic and social implications with respect to legacies of slavery and anti-Blackness, leading to spiritual outcomes such as self-fashioning and self-possession for Black communities, outcomes not necessarily measured or captured by modern ideas of political liberation that tend to be indexed to the state. I'm going to say more about that. I ask, what if we understand practices like spirit power as tense responses that are not always intentionally aimed towards structural liberation in the modern political sense of the term, but nevertheless constituted by attempts, that is by Black communities in this case, to employ possibilities for self-expression and self-possession within systems of anti-Blackness. Put another way, I want to think of spirit power and its spiritual, as well as diverse spiritual outcomes. One being wonder, self-fashioning and self-possession, this sort of in a cluster together, as equally important Black religious responses to white fascism and authoritarianism. That self-possession, wonder, and self-fashioning are equally important in ways that are sort of equal to, say, calls for structural liberation, right? Calls for policy, policy remedies, that these sorts of Black religious responses are important. I want to offer complex articulations of the religious self that resist easy categorization and refuse binary notions of agency or subjection, liberation or accommodation. In our current authoritarian political moment, having a capacious, diverse sense of how Black communities are religiously responding to fascist regimes matters. Moreover, Black religious practices of spirit power offer a way to think about the epistemic and social effects of wonder, which raise questions around the purposes and ends of Black religion and Christian theology more broadly. So to unfold this argument on the efficacy of spirit power in creating diverse Black religious contexts for wonder and self-fashioning, I first note the enslaved context of spirit power, and this is the late 19th century for the most part, and how it enabled enslaved Blacks to experience not only retribution and protection, but also wonder and pleasure amid the devastations of slavery. I then turned to early 20th century Black Pentecostal practices of spirit power through Charles Harrison Mason's sign reading. Charles Harrison Mason is the founder of the Church of God in Christ. This is a denomination that comes out of the Azusa Street Revival of 1906, and it's the largest Black Pentecostal denomination at this point. So I want to focus in on one particular Black Pentecostal practice of spirit power, Charles Harrison Mason's sign reading, to demonstrate how this practice of spirit power offered experiences of wonder, self-fashioning, and self-possession under American racial apartheid. I conclude by maintaining that practices of spirit power might reorient spirit language towards themes of wonder and self-possession as crucially important political victories, right? That wonder, the way in which wonder is taken up into acts and practices of self-possession and pleasure by Black communities, that I wanted to construe these sort of practices as essentially political, right? Which oftentimes is not quite construed as such, depending, right, on how one understands the political. But that these are political victories within death-dealing systems under what many people are describing today as Trump Crow. So spirit power. Before turning to early Black Pentecostalism to flesh out how spirit power functions as a religious practice of wonder, I want to briefly describe what I mean when I say spirit power. I am not appealing to a Christian Trinitarian discourse to understand spirit as person or expression of the Godhead. I don't think that my project negates that, but that's not where I begin. I am also not speaking about the spirit, with respect to its systematics, which I think attempts to ensure doctrinal coherence and fidelity to a theological system that is overly preoccupied with metaphysics and ontology in discussions of divine life. When I speak of spirit power, I am phenomenologically referring to how Afro-diasporic communities have invoked spirit and spirits to access power in enacting a range of religious practices and spiritual outcomes in the throes of a colonialist and anti-Black war. Among Black religious communities, spirit power is an embodied, earthwise set of rituals and practices in responding to their cultural, social, and economic dislocation and search for meaning. In this sense, power is not something owned, concentrated only in the hands of the elite or privileged. In a Foucauldian sense, power instead is shared, even if within asymmetrical relations or uneven relations, making power a feature that is simply constitutive of the relational fields out of which we act, which include both human and more than human actors, the more than human world creation. So I draw on Black women historians Alexis Wells, Obigama, and Yvonne Chareau's discussions of spirit power to think theologically and ethically about this term. This is a term that shows up primarily in the anthropological and historical literature, and I wanted to think theologically about it. As Wells Obigama notes, spirit power, quote, was morally neutral and could be used for good or bad ends, end quote. And this is concerning the early enslaved, enslaved communities. In this understanding, spirit power is not solely understood as a transcendent power that a divine actor grants to human agents below, nor is spirit power singularly defined by the moral or ideal qualities of a deity, but is the invocation of a transimmanent cosmic energy or force which has enabled dispossessed Black communities to respond to the diversely material yet incalculable worlds, offering efficacious ways to engage the ordinary and extraordinary dimensions of their existence. Spirit power was about efficacy, and the enslaved sought to harness power for retributive justice, as well as wonder and pleasure. Consider Julia Brown, a 19th century enslaved woman in Georgia, who had no problem narrating Christianity's retributive justice when her master, Mr. Jim, died. In fact, she described his death as divine justice. After summing up his cruelty as a slave plantation master, she remarked that none of her fellow slave community members lamented his death. Upon hearing of their master's death, they, quote, all said God got tired of Mr. Jim being so mean and killed him. Images of divine justice color her theological remarks, suggesting a belief in a posthumous punishment for oppressors. For Julia, the enslaved people's sufferings and their appeals to divine authority wielded a power to not only potentially kill slaveholders, but to introduce just cosmic punishment to oppressors associated with the slave system. Another way of saying it, God killed Mr. Jim to protect the local slave community from his extreme cruelty. Julia had no issue reconciling her Christian faith to the imprecatory Psalms. White Christian appeals to the love commandment were seen as morally suspicious when turning to the retributive uses of spirit power for Black enslaved folks like Julia Brown. Yet spirit power for these enslaved women was not just about retribution, protection, or justice, but about wonder and pleasure. So I'm trying to sort of present a very complex view, right, of this idea of spirit power for the enslaved community, but of wonder and pleasure. Aunt Darkis, a renowned healer and root worker who lived in McDonough, Georgia, attributed her pharmacological and healing gifts to the all-encompassing spirit known as the Lord. Although blind, Aunt Darkis routinely went to the woods to collect roots and herbs, explaining that, quote, the Lord told her what roots to get, end quote. Many local slaves reported that if you wanted to get healed, you went to Aunt Darkis. She would draw a bucket of water from the well and quote, heal the water by whispering and waving her hand over it, end quote. Combining the rites of the conjurer with Christian faith, she said, quote, the Lord gave her power and vision, end quote, to accomplish remarkable healings and other things. For Aunt Darkest, her invocation of spirit power was about pleasure and wonder associated with being used by the Lord to help others heal from physical and non-physical wounds and trauma. And those who encountered Aunt Darkest report seeing conjuring with a kind of firstness, experiencing as if for the first time possibilities of life with respect to root-based faith and healing. And that's important because right at this time, root-based faith healings and practices were held as demonic, right? They were sort of seen as primitive and not Christian. Enslaved women's religious practices of spirit power were oriented towards survival, yes, but they were also in service to wonder and pleasure, which avoids, I think, a reductive interpretation of the meanings of spirit power among the enslaved, such as, for example, one interpretation being that their religious were being solely in service to resistance, right? This is what I'm trying to sort of push back against, that this is the only or primary motif through which to understand these practices of spirit power. As one might already discern, spirit power was not simply a human power. For example, how enslaved Black women accessed this spirit power was also in concert with the material elements of the earth. The forest where the brush arbor resided also had spiritual power. The forest was the site in which the material realm of flora, fauna, earth, and water existed inseparably with the invisible domain of spiritual beings and their powers. The sacred significance of the forest as a space of hidden knowledge and powerful spirits contributed to enslaved women and girls' decisions to go to the forest or brush arbor to heal from loss, rape, and other trauma. Predominantly young enslaved women between the ages 15 and 16 were drawn to enslaved religious gatherings, particularly to praise plantation houses or religious gatherings in the brush arbor because of its healing properties. Interestingly, many of these girls joined right when they were attaining sexual maturity. Religious encounters in the praise houses and other hidden spaces were replete with initiation rituals for predominantly female initiates who were looking not only for healing against sexual violence, but also looking to experience delight and wonder inside of their community. Spirit power then was a transimmanent presence, fleshly and corporeal, that was made possible through the sensible world, yet an immeasurability and excess beyond the enslaved understandings of this world. Religious gatherings for the enslaved, away from the white gaze, allowed a certain privacy to practice these ecstatic forms of spirit power, deemed savage, demonic, and even subversive. Praise plantation houses, as well as the brush arbor or hush harbor, as is often probably more well known as being referred to, were places in the woods and forests where the enslaved could enact dances, prayers, cultural repertoires, while referring to them simply as prayer meetings. Here they engaged in practices of spirit power that provided capacious context, I would argue, capacious context of wonder, self-possession, self-fashioning, spiritual outcomes not necessarily reducible to the trope of political liberation. Another way of putting it, while liberation is desired, I want to be clear about that, while liberation is desired, the value of their spirit practices is grounded in a capacious and wondrous reimagination of God, themselves, and the world, despite slavery's brutalities. So the early Black Pentecostal founder and figure, Charles Harrison Mason, this is moving into the early 20th century, the founder of the Church of God in Christ, by the acronym is COGIC, I think is an exemplar of spirit power as a pneumatic ritual and practice of wonder and self-fashioning. And I think it's important, I don't have a sentence in here that says this, so I probably should qualify this here, that in certain accounts, there is sort of an assumption, it is, it's oftentimes explicitly said within Black religious literature that much of how I describe sort of the religious worlds of the enslaved into the 19th century, and what again anthropologists and historians term as spirit power. Now me, thinking theologically about it here for the rest of the lecture, that is something primarily that is happening in the 19th century. But at the turn of the 20th century, we see less of that, right? That for the most part, much of Black communities are grounded in sort of Christian faith, right? And so I think that there's been this assumption, again, within the literature. I think the last probably decade and a half, there have been more scholars that have been trying to challenge this, right? And so I'm sort of throwing my hat into the ring, so to speak. But that actually these practices of spirit power remain, they actually remain and even amplify into the 20th century in sort of defining and coloring the way in which Christian faith would be practiced. And so this is what I want to get at now, moving into just one figure in terms of Black Pentecostal practice, Charles Harrison Mason. He's an exemplar of spirit power as a pneumatic ritual and practice of wonder and self-fashioning. A man who referred to God as a wonder worker. That's what he said all the time. God is a wonder worker, right? And saw wonder as having epistemic and social consequences. And for me, when I say epistemic and social consequences, immediately what I'm hoping is conveyed is that in this case, wonder is just not like a state of experiencing ineffability, right? So a kind of state of awe or a state of sort of the sublime, right? But that something else is going on in an experience of wonder that in some ways reshuffles our knowledge, our the forms of the epistemically speaking about how we understand the world. I want to note that my idea of wonder is not sanitized and childlike, right? It's like, oh, wonder, so fuzzy. Taking my cue from cultural theorist Sarah Ahmed, who situates her feminist work within a philosophical tradition of wonder. You think about it, this philosophical tradition of wonder in many ways goes all the way back to sort of Plato, right, within the Western philosophical tradition. Moves through sort of the Western canon where you have people like, Descartes, Kant, even figures like Adam Smith, right, moral philosopher and political economist, that are thinking about the place of wonder in some ways, with respect to the moral life and knowledge itself. But taking my cue from Sarah Ahmad, a feminist cultural theorist, she situates her feminist work within a philosophical tradition of wonder. Her conception of wonder, and this is sort of what is important to me and what I take up is something about what Ahmad is doing. Her conception of wonder does not suspend our background knowledge, as in something wondrous happens, and in some ways it's in radical discontinuity with what we know, right? So she wants to say, no, that's not what I mean when I invoke wonder, and I'm gonna want to say the same. Her can say it does not suspend our background knowledge. Rather, wonder breaks through our background knowledge, reshuffling and revolutionizing what we know. Wonder directs itself to the ordinary and quotidian, not just to the exceptional. For example, knowledge about race or power or gender relations and their histories are not simply forgotten or abandoned when appealing to wonder. They are reconsidered in light of our current shock and surprise of the limit and unknown that appears to us, beckoning us to beckoning us to practice cognitive accommodation with respect to our epistemic forms and bodies of knowledge around race, power, and gender, right? And this has been part of like what scholarship does, right? It sort of breaks through the background knowledge. We recognize the limits, right? Someone enables us to see something different, and it reshuffles our knowledge about what we take gender to be, what do we take race to be, at an epistemic level on down. And this is a part of what at least I mean by wonder. As Ahmed reminds us, wonder works to transform the ordinary. Newness, surprise, and shock emerge from the ordinary, out of what we currently know, but offers us an unanticipated encounter that reshuffles how we see things. Spirit power operates in this way, I'm wanting to argue, as a pneumatic ritual and cognitive technology of wonder that reshuffles how we see, think, and imagine God, humans, more than human others, and the broader cosmos. So then Charles Harrison Mason, his practices of spirit power engaged wonder as an epistemic emotion in cognitive technology. And as a side note, I talk about this as reimagined. Some have interpreted early Black Pentecostal practices as sort of marked by otherworldly, apolitical, and withdrawn postures, like, compensatory and so forth, with respect to social and political life. And of course, in that book, I disagreed, right? Disagreed. And so then part of what I'm wanting to show here as a sort of extension of that book is the way in which this practice that Mason has going with spirit power, the way he's engaging wonder that in some ways is directly engaging the political milieu of the day and offering very complex Black religious responses. So to understand Mason's practice of spirit power, one must first foreground Mason as a sign reader and interpreter. Mason taught and preached using signs. And as a side note, there are like millions in the Church of God in Christ alone. I know I was one before I went to Divinity school that literally don't know this history. They don't know the history of their own founder. So just as a side note, so this is why this is so incredibly important. Mason taught and preached using signs. Signs are objects or events that point to something or someone else. The significance of the sign, the object or event, lies in its capacity to represent something of a spiritual nature, participating in the reality to which it points. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, signs were the largest body of spiritual beliefs among Blacks in the South. Historian Lawrence Levine notes that African slaves believed that human beings could read the phenomena surrounding and affecting them because they were part of, not alien to, the diverse world of species, flora, fauna, and landscapes. Black people's ability to survive and be creative depended on their discernment of the signs, which existed everywhere through understanding visions and dreams that visited them, as well as communing with the spirits that filled the world. The universe was not silent. It spoke to those who knew how to listen. There were signs indicating what the weather would be, signs telling of the coming of strangers or loved ones, signs prophesying bad luck or good fortune, signs warning of impending whipping or the approach of white patrols, signs foretelling imminent illness or death. African Americans who grew up in agricultural contexts were exposed to Black folk beliefs in signs. Learning the signs was as important as learning the task of manual labor in farming during slavery and post-emancipation. Before industrialization swept across the nation, the majority of the American population lived in rural areas. 60% of Americans did. For Blacks, 9 out of 10 lived in the South, and more than 80% of these persons in the South lived in rural areas. Even with the Great Migration, the shift in residency from rural to urban did not result in the disappearance of rural lifestyles. At the start of urbanization, cities in the South had a rural character to them. It was common then for persons living in cities to cultivate, that is, Black persons here living in cities, to cultivate vegetable gardens and keep chickens, cows, hogs, horses, and other animals. Hence, signs were central to Black folk religion and constituted a key dimension of spirit power for them. This Southern Black folk tradition about signs encompassed a belief that the natural world was a spiritual universe imbued with meanings in which signs are indications that God is active and participating in the world, in the cosmic world and human life. Signs through events and natural objects symbolize God's presence, and these signs were reverenced for the truths they communicate. Southerners conditioned their daily living around signs, which helped one discern the importance of natural objects from nature as signs for Mason. And I'm using the language trying to be true to historically how historians are describing Masons' interaction through natural objects, but as just as a side note, and the way that I'm writing about spirit power is, I think that that term itself is problematic. It's saying natural object. I mean, there's sort of a notion that there's subjectivity that other species and the landscape are imbued with, right? And so what does it mean to think of creation more broadly having subject status, right? Rather than being objectified, but nevertheless, these were things from broader creation that served as signs for Mason. Black religious scholars such as Yvonne Sherrill and Ithiel Clemens write at length about Charles Harrison Mason owning a collection of unusually formed objects, including roots, branches, and vegetables that he consulted as, quote, sources for spiritual revelations, end quote, which revisited the Black enslaved tradition of conjuring charms. As Sharon notes, quote, Mason would illustrate his sermons by referring to these objects as earthly signs, end quote. As C.G. Brown, a secretary of the Church of God in Christ in the early 20th century, wrote, quote, when scriptural texts seem to fail and audiences seem to tire of the monotony of sermons, the Spirit directs Elder Mason's mind to a sign. As he turns it, that is the natural object, over from side to side, God's mystery comes out of it, end quote. Mason delivered divine interpretations while meditating on misshapen tree limbs, stones, or even the entrails of chickens. Brown commented that it appears that he is reading one of the recesses of the object from which he is preaching. Brown offers, that is the secretary of Kojic, that is sort of recording Mason's practices. Brown offers a positive assessment of Mason's usage of signs through natural objects, unlike the white community in Memphis. In the Commercial Appeal, the primary newspaper in Memphis, Tennessee at that time, a white reporter wrote an article headline, "Versatile Negro Preacher Uses Freak Vegetables to Paint a Moral and Illustrate the Powers of God." In this article, the reporter finds Mason's use of oddly shaped vegetables for sermon illustrations a bizarre and crude term in quote-unquote Negro religion. He finds incoherent and off-putting Mason's interpretations of several sweet potatoes, an Irish potato, and an okra pod. These kinds of practices were Black folk religion. Diverse forms of Black religion, including Black Christianity, was fused with Black folk beliefs and practices. Mason's usage of these signs could certainly be read as a refusal of white American Christianity and its systems of racial apartheid, right? So it can be read as a form of resistance for sure. To those among Mason during this period, they would have easily discerned his sign reading as infusing Christian practice with conjuring culture seen on slave plantations, and in early emancipated Black communities. A conjuring culture that was seen as socially primitive and religiously demonic to American Christianity. In Bishop Clemens' biography, Bishop C.H. Mason and the Roots of the Church of God in Christ, he argues that Mason was, quote, committed to preserving the African spirit cosmology and other distinctive African cultural expressions amid the daily experiences of racist assault, end quote. Yet Sherrill cautiously notes that Pentecostal healing practices designated as African and magical, such as anointing the sick with oil, laying on of the hands, and the commission of special cloths and handkerchiefs, are also found in the New Testament, which certainly questions whether Mason's practice of divining messages from natural objects was simply an extension of African diasporic conjuring culture. Whether directly African or quasi-African, Mason's practice of spirit power through sign reading was a Black folk tradition that engaged wonder as an epistemic emotion. Wonder reshaped and reshuffled knowledge about God and the world. In Mason's case, how one comes to know about God and the world. When people saw Mason divining messages from these various objects, such as roots, bones, vegetables, and so forth, They would have heard conjure and hoodoo language in these practices. For instance, Elder C.G. Brown described how Elder Mason would calmly pick up a stick shaped in the exact likeness of a snake and its growth and demonstrate with such power that thousands of hearers are put in wonder. This conjuring and hoodoo language in Mason's practices were certainly controversial, even among elders and members in Kojic. So this is not just coming from the outside, but people on the inside are going, you're going too far, right? Yet Brown would affirm Mason's Christian conjuring practices, and a slew of Black women within the Church of God in Christ would. And I can talk more, about that in the Q&A on sort of the women's role and the place within the context of these practices, but very much so supported him. And would often say that those that protested demonstrated short-sightedness and a lack of spiritual vision. It is clear that Mason is doing something controversial as he amplifies the possibilities of an expansive Black religiosity that presses the limits of a doctrinally inflected account of Christian faith. Even within the Pentecostal context he led. This is what I mean by the way that his practice of sign reading and his engagement with wonder, explicitly the language he's using is wonder, in many ways is reshuffling what people take it's reshuffling how people are coming to understand the very knowledge foundations upon which they might think of God or Jesus or the world, right through Mason's various practices. Even if unintentionally, Mason is imploding a colonial paradigm of how religious knowledge is attained, not simply through systematic dogmas and doctrines, but more crucially through indigenous rituals and practices that involve effective awareness and interdependence with the land and other species to attain knowledge about God. Mason's sign reading is not just a pneumatic ritual, but a cognitive technology of wonder, reshaping for many of his hearers how they think and feel God and the world in more surprising and capacious ways. I want to linger with what Kojic Secretary Brown says about Mason's divining work or his practice of spirit power. That through his practices, that is Mason's, of sign reading, people are put in wonder. Mason engages our more than human world and invites his listeners to hear gospel stories, the life of Jesus with the firstness, as if for the first time, allowing listeners to reimagine in an affective register, that's with the emotions, what they think they know about God and the world. Wonder in this case is not solely about being in a state of surprise or mystery. Wonder is more crucially operating as a cognitive technology, meaning that this experience of wonder turns one toward what they don't know, begging for cognitive accommodation. One desires to do something in light of a religious paradigm that has now been unsettled, no longer able to predict what one thought they knew about God and the world. These were some of the conversations that C.J. Brown will be recording about how the people were responding verbally to the various practices of Mason. For certain, wonder being employed as a cognitive technology can go wrong. Right? We see this, really, like religious death cults, right? It can go wrong. So, wonder being a cognitive technology alone does not vindicate it as some sort of positive practice, right? And I can talk a bit more about sort of how I understand the criteria, the possibilities for wonder being engaged in a way that promotes flourishing. However, in this case, Mason's practice of spirit power through sign reading allowed Christian faith in this Black Pentecostal context to generatively be practiced as an open question on how the Spirit is moving, not beholden to a rigid dogmatic certainty that constrains and dismisses indigenous religious forms. His practice of spirit power had epistemic implications. It offers the possibility of the rediscovery of the intense experience of divine presence in repressed and silenced Black religious orientations, a rediscovery that opened to new theological questions and avenues of thought that before could not be asked or practiced. And again, as I said, I mentioned a bit earlier, enslaved religious practices were under severe controversy. They were being seen as fundamentally unchristian. And you not only had white Christian communities, but even upper class African American communities that were seeking to police um, uh, communities that were engaging in these kinds of particular practices. But that Mason, in some ways, is embodying and sort of taking into his understanding of Christian faith, right? These very practices, and in this way, opens the religious form up and allows a reimagination of what Christian faith was and could be through these indigenous forms. Mason's practice of spirit power through sign reading not only had epistemic implications, but also had social consequences. Mason's practices of spirit power through wonder might be understood as encouraging and cultivating Black self-fashioning, which complicates current conversations in critical Black studies. I'm sort of turning to and adjacent to religious studies for many Black scholars and Black theologians of critical Black studies as African American studies on debates of subjection or agency, accommodation or liberation with respect to anti-Black systems. As I asked at the start of this lecture, what if we understand practices like spirit power as tense responses that are not always aimed towards structural liberation in the modern sense of the term, but nevertheless constituted by attempts to employ limited possibilities for self-expression and self-possession within systems of anti-Blackness? I interpret spirit power as a form of religious self-fashioning and self-possession within Black life. And what I mean by these terms, self-possession is a way, right, for Black communities and individuals to gather to sort of reassert their own sense of dignity and their own sense of meaning against the backdrop, right, of sort of imposed colonial meanings, which highlights the creative religious ways that Blacks navigated American racial hierarchy in plantation slave economies with little to no freedom, cultivating experiences of defiance, friendship, care, pleasure, joy, despite the near totalizing context of anti-Blackness. Through practices like spirit power, many Black communities developed interior worlds and realities that enable them to affirm diverse ways of Black living inside and despite slavery's logic and afterlives. As Black feminist Tina Kemp notes, Black self-fashioning allows for, quote, complex articulations of the self that resist easy categorization and refuse binary notions of agency versus subjection, end quote. The religious practices that I've been talking about thus far, like spirit power of the enslaved and post-emancipated Black communities, are neither wholly liberatory vehicles of agency, transcendence, or performativity, nor unilateral instruments of objectification and abjection. In the words of Kemp, they are always already at once. Another way of saying it's complicated, right? Against the backdrop of empire, right? In the ways in which communities find themselves responding. Right? Through spirit power, Blacks were able to engage in a way that allowed them to reassemble in dispossession. Self-fashioning is a mode of engagement of a process Kemp calls reassemblage in dispossession. As Blacks experience totalizing dominative systems, their responses often were everyday micro shifts in the social order of racialization that just temporarily reconfigured their status as being dispossessed. I think too much pressure is placed on whether Black religious practices are liberatory and subversive or accommodationist and passive, which obscures the multiple meanings of Black religion. In this case, Black practices such as spirit power. Instead, Black self-fashioning privileges how Black practices enable reassemblage and dispossession, allowing for a range of creative responses to emerge that details Black livingness. That's to use Black feminist Catherine McKittrick's words. In, under, and despite the demand for Black death. Reassemblage and dispossession emphasizes the practices through which racialized subjects redeploy relations of power in unintended ways, often with unexpected outcomes, while attempting to inhabit social life, nevertheless within the context of death-dealing systems. This is how wonder operated within Mason's sign reading as an epistemic emotion and cognitive technology that socially allowed dispossessed Blacks to live. And when I say live, not just biologically, but with all the meaning-making capacities to live. They are not ravaged. And wonder epistemically guides them in fashioning alternate ways of living inside of an order bent on their destruction. As religious historian Ahmad Green Hayes reminds us, the paradox of Black Atlantic religion making was not simply about Blacks practicing religious activities deemed lewd and demonic to resist, as much as it was about, I quote him here, quote, finding pleasure in the idea of self-possession on the one hand and possession by the spirits on the other, end quote. It's a really provocative in my opinion. Because again, it's saying something about more of what's at play in Blacks' responses to the political carnage and fallout, and the way in which their Black religious responses in some ways should be valued and not secured simply through the motive of structural liberation. Practice of spirit allowed an alternative experience within a dolorous world that often blocked delight and joy for these communities. Practices of spirit power allowed Blacks to reassemble in dispossession, redefining what was possible and even living into futures they wanted to feel, perhaps not see, but feel, futures they wanted to feel, even if these moments were episodic and fleeting. In conclusion, my conversation of spirit power as a pneumatic ritual and cognitive technology of wonder is not just a historical conversation. It has implications for us today. And I have like 3 chapters in the manuscript talking about contemporary implications, okay? So, although I only was able to get to the historic piece this, for this evening. One implication I can only gesture toward in a few sentences. Spirit power as a ritual of wonder recalibrates what we take to be Christian faith in our current religious and political context of fascism and collective stupidity. And let me just say this, that's not my term. That actually is a philosophical term for the book. That actually is a one that begins to write about and talk about collective stupidity in a rather ironic way. And it is something that I've been thinking about and what like really wanting to take seriously the problems and really the banality of collective stupidity and how it gets us to a particular point in political life, right? That at one point we could have imagined, right, we would actually be here. But the spirit power again recalibrates what we take to be Christian faith, right? In this context, the one we are living in right now, a politics of wonder reshuffles how we see things, what we take to be the political, and what faith means to living and responding within a world marked by both possibility and violence, death and livingness. Spirit power and its spiritual outcomes, such as wonder and self-fashioning, matter not only to how we speak about the purposes and ends, I think of both Black religion and Christian theology that is more broadly, but also to how we describe Black life in the wake of slavery's afterlives. And what constitutes important religious responses, right? It's like, that's primarily what I'm after. What do we take to be important religious responses, right? Against the backdrop of fascism and other forms of political authoritarianism. Turning to spirit power as a pneumatic ritual of wonder that is cognitive technology of wonder, rethinks the hubris of Christian theology and even some forms of Black religion that depend on the trope of political liberation, that is structural liberation in particular, to secure the value and meaning of religion and faith. I want to be clear, I do not mean to deny that the category of liberation matters. That's not what I'm saying. It does matter. It clearly does. However, much of theological liberalism, and that's in all of its strands, white, Black, Latinx, much of theological liberalism, I think, overinvests in this being the primary way of interpreting the salience and relevance of religion and religious action, as if it needs to be linked with justice demands directed towards the state to secure its value. Instead, I want us to pause and think about what is left out of such an account of the value and usefulness of religion and faith. So it's not a negation, right, of political liberation in and of itself. But when that becomes the primary trope, what is left out, right? What religious strategies and outcomes are rendered invisible and even described as bastardized versions of true religion? Because they take up the affective and ecstatic dimensions of faith that may equally prefer delight to conversations of equity, wonder to discussions of structural change. Thank you.
Wow. Um, we are open for Q&A at the moment. And I'm looking online to see if anybody has any questions as well, but the floor is open for any questions for Dr. Day.
When you're talking about spirit power, I'm thinking about Sinners, the movie. I'm thinking about Wicked and how the church, in particular my Kojic folks, went spastic about nobody go see it, boycott it. But when they look at the roots of Bishop Mason and all of the stuff that he did, I don't see how in the world they could talk about these movies when it's right there in what he did.
I mean, you sort of, yes, amen. Like I want to say amen to that. But I think, and if I can keep with the current implications of, what I just lectured on, thank you. In line with this sort of this problem that you're raising, like in our contemporary context, let's say with like a number of Black churches is, it seems to me that even among many, I would say many to most Black churches that clearly are opposed, right, to the forms of political authoritarianism that we are witnessing right now, their theology is unable to uphold their political postures, right? Because their theology, and I mean, right, this is rooted in a very deep history, that their theologies, and as a side note, I think that I'll say this before I come back. As a side note, I think that like historians, Black historians have been writing about this for some time. Black religious historians, I should say, have been writing about this. Lawrence Levine, I'm drawing Louis Baldwin, something Stuckey. I don't know why I'm getting the first name. Deep as Rivers, all the way to Yvonne Chirot, Barbara Savage. I can go down the list right on current historians that have been writing about Black religious experience. That in some ways, part of what is transpiring the late 19th century into the 20th century is literally the policing, in many ways, of African American religious experience, as many communities are beginning to embrace kind of appropriations of Christian faith, but sort of away from slaveholding Christianity, right, towards something that is justice filled. But part of the problem with all of this is that it's the policing, right, that in many ways leads to many of these Black communities wanting to think more doctrinally in that sense, more strictly, I should say, doctrinally in that sense about Christian faith. But I will say this, that I mean, part of the conversation about why the sort of Calvinist conservative theologies that still seep through the sort of the Black church DNA. I mean, this also has to do with political citizenship. What it meant to achieve political citizenship at the beginning of the 20th century for Black communities had everything to do with what it meant to be a proper religious subject. So this is not to give necessarily Black communities a pass, but it is to contextualize them and to understand that in many cases, they were attempting to move toward a project of political citizenship that necessitated, right, thinking about publicly at least how they appeared in terms of their religious subjectivity, right? And it couldn't be the antiquated pagan, primitive retentions of Africa through which, right? Because that would never achieve citizenship. But rather it was a kind of an assimilative project. And so that's just one, again, what I'm saying right here is maybe just one among a sort of diverse way of thinking about why then you have a number of people, particularly within the Black community, particularly in Black churches, that have these visceral responses, right, to movies like Sinners. But again, for me, what is interesting is that in some ways it doesn't track with the political postures. In some ways, actually reinforces in these rather indirect ways within their very communities of some of the sort of authoritarian assumptions that undergird the kind of white evangelicalism and white Christian nationalism that we're seeing today. So it's a dilemma.
I'm gonna throw a question in while we wait for the microphone, and I can see you as well. I was gonna ask a different question, if spirit power was related to creativity, but I think I want to ask a different question. What are Black people free to be without their religious expression being connected to a political project?
Mhm.
Wow.
You know, in Azusa Reimagine, I try to rethink the idea of the political. I mean, so in the modern sense of the term, the idea or the sphere of the political, I mean, this is a debate that goes on within political theology, right? Is oftentimes the idea of the political that we have in mind, particularly like a liberationist, not all, but some feminist, oneness, and so post-colonial, decolonial, is this idea of the political that is indexed to the state, right? And so the idea of the political is that that literally tracks with and finds its voice, its consciousness through resistance to the state and through, in some ways, participating in the resources of the state. Now, I don't want to problematize that in and of itself, right? Like, yes, like Dolores Williams is right. For example, Black women that are attempting to survive and, are primary caretakers of Black children, what does it mean, to have daily needs met? It means that one has to appeal to certain resources that the state holds. Like, right, that's important. And at the same, this is not a but, it's an and. And at the same time, I think maybe the poverty of thinking about the idea of the political ultimately is having to be indexed to the state is it doesn't allow for, in many ways, other conceptions of the political, or another way of saying it, the diverse ways in which people come into political voice that don't quite track with the deliberative democratic procedures that we might refer to as the state, right? Government or something like that. So I give an example you have the civil rights movement, right? Which of course is one example of what I just named. But in its early iterations, this is why I love the book At the Dark End of the Street, right? Where initially you have Rosa Parks, this is prior to Rosa Parks being known as not getting up from her seat on the bus. In the 1940s, they're organizing against sexual violence for Black women, right? And there's a part in that book where some of the women that end up, and some of these are charismatic, like Pentecostal women, that end up participating in just the local raising awareness. So they're not participating directly, right, in the judicial or in the quote unquote political structures at the time, trying to sort of seek appeal to what happens to Reese Taylor, which is part of what the book is about. But in some ways are within their church communities trying to draw attention to the nature of white sexual violence, right? So they're doing this through songs in their community, right? They're doing this through oral tradition, maybe I could call it, where they're telling stories about what has happened in the past. Nancy Fraser refers to this as counterpublics, right, in some ways, where here you have a group of women that are not being political in the overt sense of the term, like directly throwing, their hands to the fray of politics, but in some ways, they are attempting to shape the social and political subjectivity of the women that are a part of their community. And they're doing it in these religiously liturgical ways, right? Through song, right? Through oral tradition, through the telling of stories, through quilt work, all these various ways of thinking about. So for me, the idea of the political, right, needs to be something much more expansive. So I think in that way, I probably couldn't answer, I mean, your question is so rich. And so in this very small way, what does it mean to be free apart? I think that part of even how we think of freedom then needs to be rethought, right? It is it simply like, we want equity, we want equality, but does freedom take on this sort of multivalent, these diverse kinds of meanings? So that even though segregation is still very much a part, and even sexualized violence, of these early women that are a part of what Rosa Parks is doing in a kind of peripheral way, they yet are experiencing a certain kind of existential freedom to be, but it's not transcending the racial strictures of society. I really do prefer people like Catherine McKittrick and other Tina Camp and other Black feminists that say really that these women are existing and being free in, under, and despite systems of anti-Blackness. So it's not they're transcending, right? That the systems are still there, but they're finding ways to navigate and find, and in that sense, right? Freedom is something that in terms of agency, they would say something that's being exercised, although subjection, right, is still prominently. So I mean, this gets into all kind of like philosophical, theological questions about freedom and agency and subjection, but I think this is an example of the power, I think, of what I'm trying to get at and talk about wonder.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Day, for this brilliant lecture, and the answers have been rich as well to the questions. One of the threads in your lecture that I followed really closely was spirit power as self-possession. And I appreciated the way that you wove that thread in, and then you brought up that really powerful quote from my brother, my Green Haynes. And from my kind of seat in New Testament early Christianity, we've been doing a lot of thinking around like the language of possession, especially spirit possession as kind of replicating kind of kyriarchal and enslaving logics in the ancient world. And it seems that there's a play you're doing. I want to see you reflect a little bit more. I'm sure you were doing this in your work, and I just wanted to hear the thoughts of like these people who in the 19th century are possessions.
Yeah.
To go from being possessed by the spirit to self-possess. Like I see that it's something that you're thinking through, and I'd love to hear you say a little bit more.
Oh, that is so rich. And actually, I want to get a hold of some of the work that's going on in the New Testament to see what are the parallels between how this is being talked about within the literature I'm reading. That I did not realize that in New Testament studies that there's some of that work going on. Yes, I mean, part of what you're saying, right? That they are seen as commodities, right? They are seen as property and possession. And part of, I think, what was so compelling about Dr. Green Hayes' work I think this is in the 19th, 20th century in Louisiana. It's part of, I'm trying to remember the title of the book right now. Do you remember the title of the book? Just so those that want to read it, I'm drawing a blank here. Yeah, that's okay. I thought maybe if you knew it. But what I find compelling about his work is in talking about spirit possession, again, historically within the literature, this is just not in the literature of religious studies, but this is like in the anthropological literature and the historical literature, is that, 20th century scholarly conversations have simply thought about acts or practices of spirit possession being sort of private in character, a kind of privatized interpretation. This is sort of the practices that they do in order to compensate, in order, to cope. So there's been a kind of compensatory reading, right, of these practices. But what I appreciate about his work is the way in which he really does try to allow this conversation of spirit possession to take on a kind of then social. And when I say political quality, not as in the world of politics, right? But that in some ways, the initiation into the spirit realm, in some ways, is indirectly, not that it's even the intention of the initiate, but it's indirectly talking back to the colonial realm, the anti-Black realm, in such strong ways that, as he talks about in the book, you have not just the entire policing of this underground world of religious activity, but eventually, like, when I say policing, like, eventually it would be like white Christian communities and even law enforcement would be resulting to violence, right? I mean, there was like, in other words, this underground work was really a threat, is the point here. Not just religiously, but socially, politically, and even economically, okay? Because these are also bodies out of order, out of the productivity of capitalist time, right? So they go down to the city square, they go down wherever they go, and they're participating in these various modes. And I talk about this in Azusa Reimagined, where, you know, in the Azusa Street Revival, you know, they might be getting the eating, they might go to wee early hours in the morning, and they're getting complaints, right? From the residents, they're saying, you know, they're noisy, I've got to wake up for work, don't they work, you know, this, that, and the other. That these are now bodies disrupting the order of capitalist time, of chrononormativity, so to speak. And so again, for me, this link between they are possessions, but then spirit possession in some ways allows those that are initiated to spirit possession to reclaim, right, one sense of humanity before God, before the spirits, before God. And in other words, it creates a counter narrative, a counter script, right, to what they've been told. And not just like ideologically, like demonstrably, viscerally, physically. Like commodification is at the level of flesh and bone, right? And so there's something about spirit possession that also shows them their bodies are beautiful, right? That there's a reclamation, in other words, just not of heart and mind, but of literally body, of black flesh itself. And I'm thinking here of like in Beloved, right, where she calls them to the clearing, love thy flesh. I mean, this is part in terms of spirit possession, what's going on. In that sense, then for me at least, self-possession becomes something that is possible that you're seeing. That even though the members are not articulating these forms of spirit possession as a direct critique to, you know, the apartheid of the day, these are bodies out of order, right? And doing something that's a tremendous threat to the white voters. So this is how I'm thinking about it. But yeah, this is later on. I'd love to get more of your thoughts on what is being talked about within New Testament studies.
Thank you. And it's underworld work.
Underworld work, yes, for those that want to read the book, I mentioned that, you mentioned that, so for those that are interested in the book, Underworld work.
Professor Day, thank you so much for an incredibly thought-provoking lecture. So I was really struck by your discussion on sign reading, because so just as a silly comparison, I'm a trauma surgeon, and we get waves of horrible amounts of work that are somewhat overwhelming, and the etiology of which seems completely unintelligible, and the timing of which is completely unpredictable. And so we get into a lot of sign reading. As a surgical team, this happens. And a lot of superstition too. But is there any way into the world of spirit power without there being a tremendous amount of both individual and community pain and suffering? And what's interesting as well, one of the other comments you made that I found very interesting was that, you know, well-to-do, more educated, you know, African-American folks, while this spirit work was going on, you know, as they perhaps gave a performance of no longer being part of that suffering world, you know, turned to critiquing this as being other from their own experience. So I wondered if you could comment on this issue of suffering and of dealing with, you know, not only a basal amount of suffering, but dealing with waves of unintelligible suffering, and the antidote of the performance of or belief of not participating in that suffering anymore.
Such a great question. All are great questions, by the way, but this is something I've been really wrestling with in my approach to the discussion, because I think you might have heard at the beginning, sort of name it as a kind of project in pneumatology. Although the term that I'm experimenting with, you get 10, you can experiment. with the term I'm experimenting with is pneumaology, pneuma-ology. And this goes to the heart of sort of the question that you're asking about suffering and spirit power. Because I mean, like historically, and this is part of the problem that I wrestle with on my methodologically, my approach, my account of spirit and hence spirit power. What is my account of spirit and hence spirit power? And part of what's interesting about that whole conversation within Christian theology, particularly pneumatology, is that the account of the spirit has been so closely tied to a kind of universal and more specifically metaphysical when I say universal, metaphysical understanding of the spirit that sort of ethically has functioned to in many ways disallow other practices and even other accounts of spirit. And I say this within a Christian community. We're not even right now talking about like, other religious traditions and how they're thinking about just within a Christian, worldwide Christian communion, historically. And again, this has to do, I think this more has to do with like the field of systematic theology, right? And the doctrines around the spirit. Interestingly, it's been so under-theorized, weirdly as well. Although what has been said, there's been sort of what has been said and assumptions behind it is that it has been simply simply read as coterminous with the Spirit of Christ, right? But even in being read coterminous with the Spirit of Christ, it still is this metaphysical, ontological understanding so that you have sort of this transcendent spirit, right? And for me, what is concerning is the way in which it negates, right? The different ways that communities, that is Christian communities in my case, are entering into their practices, actually the experiences of spirit, right? That clashes with these very heavy doctrinal understandings of spirit, which I think complicates it and does more harm than good. But then also with respect to this understanding, metaphysical understanding, transcendent, I should say, understanding of the spirit, is that it actually does not track with historically, like phenomenologically, this is why I talked about the phenomenological piece, phenomenologically, how communities are talking about, how they are experiencing the ways in which they are appealing to the spirit's presence in their life, right? Spirits. And so I just want to say that word on method, okay? That's really, really important for me because in the question of suffering, part of how I hear your question, someone else just one-on-one asked me this, Keri, I'm a good friend, and we debate all the time, Keri, oh God, not another theology of spirit that is just dependent on suffering, on black suffering. I mean, how do we, can we think about, spirit and spirits that, and for me, I think it's an interesting statement, right? Because on the one hand, I do agree that there's something deeply problematic about certain accounts that seek to reduce, in this case, the spirit's understanding simply to suffering, right? The spirit, and this is why, for me, it was so important for me to bring up, like Aunt Darkest, these women's rich appeal to the spirit world, that it's not just about suffering. It's about wonder, it's about pleasure, right? And at the same time, a recognition that because of these metaphysical accounts, often what they are silent on, what they disallow one to speak of, precisely this question of suffering, Black suffering and so forth. I mean, what does it mean to talk about spirit and spirit power if, for example, within a Trinitarian structure, the spirit is equated with the Father and Son, right? Then what kind of implications does that have for the real entanglements that you find? I don't say that in a negative sense, by the way, just descriptively. The entanglements that you find and the ways that enslaved communities are talking about spirit and spirits, right? For retributive justice, for other sorts of things. And so, so for me, it's really important, at least for me in my account, to proceed phenomenologically, in saying, that there are things that metaphysical and ontological frameworks have disallowed historically, particularly for marginalized communities. And what do we get, at least in the approach that I'm trying to take, we proceed phenomenologically in recognizing that the appeal to spirit within the context of the US, North America, the US, has been deeply stitched to the suffering, right, within an anti-Black order, but not reducible to that suffering, right? And so what I'm hoping is that it wards off this sort of this indictment that somehow I've reduced, spirit power simply to the suffering of this community. And then the last thing that I will say is, I've been turning a lot to Black feminists that are right now, and this is like Black feminists within the humanities, that are doing work like along the lines of physics metaphors and cosmology and things like that. And I think that they're really helping me. I think they're helping the field of like Black feminism and by extension womanism and hopefully religious studies to maybe rethink ideas of suffering itself. Because I mean, and rightly so within, let's say, feminist and post-colonial and womanist traditions, suffering was the narrative or the trope of suffering was used so religiously in order to subject women, right? In other words, you can't be close to God unless you suffer, right? Something like that. That suffering in many ways has become, I should say, something that is not considered as a fruitful, sort of as a fruitful resource in thinking about, theologies among the marginalized. And I've just really been, I've been interestingly surprised by Black feminists and others in the humanities and how they're turning to cosmology and physics and astronomy, the rhetorical resources, and then not literally to the math, but to the rhetorical resources as a way to rethink, right, the narratives of suffering and the place of suffering, I guess is what I'm trying to say, in the world, and how we talk about it, how we employ it in talking about human experience. So some of it's probably like a lot, but it is to say that I'm hoping that I'm not read as reducing spirit power, but that there's this very rich sort of phenomenological insight that I want to bring out about why suffering is so essential to African Americans in particular talking about the concept of spirit power. That's not, so of course it's not reduced to it.
I think I would just invert that by saying, it's not so much that you have to suffer in order to be open to the spirit, but the less suffering you have, the more conscious you have to be about being immunized against having that openness. I guess that's what I would say, is that it's not that, oh, if you're not suffering, you can't be open to God. It's just that the more comfortable we get, the more we have to be very intentional and very conscious about how we've insulated ourselves.
So friends, I didn't do all of the timekeeping.
Right.
We are at time. Please help me thank Dr. Wade. Please come to chapel tomorrow as Dr. Day will be preaching, and then she'll be joining us for community conversation as well. Thank you all for joining us online. I didn't see any questions, but thank you all for being here as well. Have a wonderful night.
Says that, these Black personalities, the